Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union. But there was once a time when he had to appear in court and defend himself. And I'm not talking about before 1917. That was Tsarist Russia. Everyone was doing a little terrorism. No, this is the story of how Stalin was taken to court in Soviet Russia and how the matter turned into a complicated plot of political intrigue and revenge. It all began on March 31st, 1918, when everyone's favorite Menshevik, Julius Martov, published an article in the newspaper Vpered. And what was the article about? Well, it was mostly about critiquing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But when replying to recent derision published in Pravda, saying the Mensheviks of Georgia were acting like the Tsar and shooting a vast number of looting revolutionaries, Martov also mentioned, offhandedly, that a certain Stalin ought to know a thing or two about looting. After all, he had been expelled by the party organization for his involvement in expropriations, meaning robberies, back in 1908. Stalin was irate. This was like calling him a hooligan. Not really the robbery part, but being expelled from the party. His credibility was on the line. So he sues Martov in the Revolutionary Tribunal for the press. But first of all, was the accusation true? Stalin did indeed have a history with expropriations. At the Fifth Party Congress, robberies had been banned. Yet only a few weeks later, the famous Tiflis robbery occurred, orchestrated by Stalin. The robbery succeeded, but was also a bit of a disaster, killing several dozen bystanders and acquiring mostly marked bills. After fleeing to Baku, Stalin continued illegal activities, up to his arrest in 1908. He was allegedly involved in several other robberies, including of a steamship called the Nicholas I. Not only did the police investigate, arresting some Bolsheviks and sending others into exile, the SD party itself investigated. Internal party disciplinary files have since been discovered, showing Stalin's involvement and that he was brought before a party committee, but the text of their decision has become lost. He may have been temporarily suspended from the party, as several other members claimed. Needless to say, it was not a far-fetched statement by Martov. On April 5th, the two men appeared before the Revolutionary Tribunal. This was a court set up about 2 months prior, with a mandate to deal with crimes against the people perpetuated by means of the press. On this, before the packed courthouse, Martov remarked, "The case shouldn't even be tried here." Last he heard, Stalin didn't personify the people. But the judge ruled it valid, demanding that Martov substantiate his claims. So he brought up the Nicholas I robbery and how Stalin was brought before the party and was expelled. He also claimed that Stalin had ordered a man in Baku beaten nearly to death for revealing this. Given the underground nature of the party, Martov said he had no written records from back then, but he gave a list of witnesses from the days in Georgia who could corroborate the details. Stalin must have realized he was in trouble at this point, since Martov named people who had been at the disciplinary hearing or would have known if he was expelled. "Dishonest slanderer!" shouted Stalin. Martov retorts, no one had known him to be a slanderer. A recess was hastily called. Well, reportedly, the courthouse gave Martov an ovation. But when they resumed, the judge initially sided with Stalin. No witnesses would need to be called. The case would be settled right then and there. No witnesses could travel from Georgia anyway. "That's not true," shouts Martov. "What about witnesses in Moscow? Stalin is afraid to speak about his past." An uproar breaks out, which has to be cleared by Red Guards. Now the case was reversing. Martov was standing by his comment and wanted to defend his honor. Stalin had said he would drop the original charges if Martov admitted he had no evidence. But now Martov would do no such thing. The judge relented and postponed a week, so testimony from witnesses could be gathered. But any testimony gathered wasn't used. The People's Commissars ended up closing the Revolutionary Tribunal for the press, with Lenin and Sverdlov intervening to close the inquiry. This was turning into a political scandal. But Stalin wasn't satisfied, complaining to the Moscow Tribunal to take up the case. The court set up for crimes of high treason. The opposition had a field day criticizing this Bolshevik leader for crying treason over an insult. But the tribunal took up the case, and when the day came, it was swarmed by observers. Taking advantage of the audience, Martov took the stand, decrying these special privileges being given to Bolshevik leaders. He argued that he had no right to be tried here, that it should go to a regular people's court, and the judge ruled in his favor. But looking over the article in question, he now declared Martov had actually insulted the Soviet government and undermined its prestige, and so he could be tried here for that. A furious Martov shot back, "This was just plain suppression of criticism. They could arrest the entire SD party if criticism was a crime." After some deliberations, the judge ruled Martov was not guilty of insulting Stalin, but guilty for insulting the government, although the punishment would only be a censuring. It was a compromise. Everyone had lost, but some people had lost more than others. Not satisfied, Stalin began working behind the scenes to get the verdict on the insult overturned. The event was great propaganda for the Mensheviks. Martov accused Stalin of acting like a monarch and argued, without criticism of government, there can be no democracy. Stalin was demanding they put an end to this Menshevik nonsense once and for all. The matter was finally brought before the Soviet executive, although many of the Bolshevik regulars didn't turn up, perhaps indicating the matter was getting silly. Trying to get it over with, without allowing any discussion, Sverdlov read out a statement saying the court case was annulled and hastily called a vote, approving the statement. "I demand the floor," shouted Martov, rushing to the podium. "Coward! Abject coward!" Sverdlov shouted over the uproar that Martov was expelled for the next 3 sessions. Others tried to get to the podium but were shouted over, until finally the Mensheviks walked out in solidarity with Martov. Although the Congress decided Martov could be retried, this never actually came about. They instead shifted their focus to the newspaper itself, leading to a new case, accusing all its editors of libel. Fyodor Dan and other top Mensheviks, that is, the people who had embarrassed the Bolsheviks the most, became the main targets. Considering Vpered was a well-circulated paper, the news of its suppression sparked some worker rallies and petitions. Not only that, they prepared for the libel case in force. On the main charge in question, that the Bolsheviks had fired upon protesters, Dan produced documentary evidence and lists of witnesses. The trial was becoming an open investigation into the Bolshevik government, which was not the plan. So at the hearing, the prosecutor, Krylenko, rejected that all this be allowed as evidence. "This was outrageous," cried Dan. "Plus, it's not like criticism of the Bolsheviks was a threat to Soviet power. The Bolsheviks weren't the only party in the Soviets, right?" This turned into a battle of legalese, with the prosecution claiming that insulting the ruling party was like insulting the state, and Dan countering that the Bolsheviks criticized the left SRs all the time, and they were a ruling party. It also goes without saying the Bolsheviks criticized, if not slandered, the Mensheviks constantly, including the Menshevik government of Georgia. Finally, the court admitted they had a right to criticize, but decided not to come to a decision on the case and adjourned. Officially, all these charges were never dropped, but they weren't reopened either. It appears the Bolsheviks weren't that enthused by Stalin's revenge scheme. Notably, only a couple B-listers came out to publicly defend Stalin. Lenin didn't want to touch this. In part, this was because many of the big-time Bolsheviks still had a begrudged respect for Martov. Some were even outright friendly still, although they greatly disagreed. Those like Lenin and Trotsky had come up with Martov from the beginning. They had lived for years together in exile. This was also a complicated period in which the Bolsheviks themselves were greatly divided. Many had sympathy for the Menshevik position, others just didn't like the idea of suppression. It was one thing to censor a Black Hundred paper, but a fellow socialist one? That was tough and controversial. The party wasn't totally convinced, nor able yet, to completely close down the rival press. And at least for now, the Mensheviks were trying to play the game and work within the Soviet laws, even if unfair. It was also clear the trials were unproductive for the party. They opened up embarrassing questions, shining a spotlight on major screw-ups, which were all then published in the press. And so the public trials had to stop. In the end, the Stalin-Martov trial was an oddity of the era, but it speaks volumes to the state of the press in early 1918. It was part of a process of narrowing the range of acceptable criticism, and also established a precedent that political institutions could be bent if needed. After this and many other fiascos, censorship was reintroduced. The tribunal for the press was quietly engulfed by the Cheka, and although the Vpered case never finished, and the paper continued to operate as a legally registered paper for a time, in May, the Cheka shut it down. All of this would come back to bite many of the Bolsheviks when they themselves disagreed with the party. But for now, that was the end of Stalin v. Martov.